Welcome, everyone, to the keynote lecture of the YIVO Bard program in Ashkenazi civilization for 2019. The lecture is going to be given by Dr. Christoph Dieckmann, who we are very, very lucky to have teaching in the program this year. I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute. And first of all, I want to thank my colleague, Ben Kaplan, whom I think many of you may know, and Jane Tushinsky, who have organized the winter program and made it run so smoothly up to now. Thank you. Let me make a couple of announcements. The first is that on January 20th, we have what I understand is the first conference on Jewish anarchism that has ever taken place. And I urge you all to come. It's going to be quite something. It starts at 10 in the morning and will end God knows when, theoretically at 8 o'clock at night. As of now, it is the most, we have more registrants for this conference than for any conference we've ever held. And so if you're interested, you should let us know immediately. I want to say a couple of words about the winter program, which is that I think 5 years ago, we began this program with the intent of broadening the range of subjects that the YIVO Institute would make available to our community, and to broaden the concept of Jewish history of Eastern Europe and Russia at the same time, to expand the focus of the YIVO Institute, which at its inception was really a mass movement that began in Vilna, Warsaw, and Berlin, and soon there were YIVO centers in New York and Cleveland and Chicago and London and Paris and throughout the world where Ashkenazi Jews had lived and did live. And it is our aim to reconnect with that community, that global community. And this program is the first step in our doing so. But we also have developed over the course of these years online educational programs which convince us of the global reach of the YIVO Institute. We have people signing up for these classes in Moscow and in Berlin and in Paris and in London and in Uganda and in Tokyo and in Guam and the Philippines and even in the state of Idaho, which is perhaps the most amazing thing. All of you who are interested in the winter program and in this broadening of our horizons, you should make an effort to find out about these online courses. There are now 3, and a new one is in development on the subject of Jewish food and Jewish cooking that will be launched sometime in 2019 or 20. 2019 or 20. Feel yourselves at home. In addition, we have undertaken a variety of projects, the purpose of which is to make the riches of this institute available to the global community. We have, as some of you know, but many of you probably do not, the largest collection of materials in the world relating to East European Jewish life and Russian Jewish life. We have 23 million documents. We have 400,000 volumes, the largest collection of Yiddish literature in the world. And we are now in the process of digitizing what we call the Vilna collections, and there's literature about it outside if any of you wish to know more about it. It's a one, in the end will be approximately 1.5 million documents and about 12,000 books that represent the core of YIVO's pre-war collections that for the first time are being documented and will be online and available for free to a global public. But now it's my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce Dr. Christoph Dieckmann. Some of you already are familiar with Dr. Dieckmann from the class that he is teaching in our winter program. He is a historian and has taught modern European history from 2005 until 2014 at Kiel University in United Kingdom. He studied Deutsche Besatzungspolitik in Litauen, 1941 to 1944, the German occupation policy in Lithuania, was published in 2011 and was awarded the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research in 2012. Since 2000, he has also been a member of the Presidential International Commission for the Evaluation of Nazi and Soviet occupation regimes in Lithuania. Until 2017, he conducted a research project called Yiddish Historiography on the Russian Civil War at the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt am Main. Presently, Dr. Dieckmann works at the University of Bern on a project focused on sound history called Sounds of Anti-Jewish Persecution. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Everybody's fine? Very good. Thanks a lot to YIVO for the kind invitation. I understand it as a great honor to be invited to speak here at YIVO on the Shoah, its history and memory. Teaching a course since last week on the Shoah in Lithuania has already been very inspiring. Now I want to use the next 35 to 40 minutes to share some of my experiences as a researcher and some of my impressions as a participant in the present public discussions of the past in Eastern Europe. So we'll have basically two sections, one on history and one on memory. The politics of history. Then we'll have hopefully some 15 minutes to debate the issues at stake. Since I will focus on the history of Lithuania as an example, we could touch other societies during the discussion. The first section I want to use as a reminder of the context in which the Shoah happened. Close to 13 million people fell victim to the Nazi regime in Europe outside of direct warfare. 5.8 million of them were Jews, 6 to 7 million of them, 55%, were non-Jews. Almost all of them were non-Germans. 79% of the Jews were non-German Jews, 95% of the non-Jewish victims were non-Germans, meaning far over 90% of the victims died outside Germany in occupied or allied societies. When did these millions of Jews and non-Jews fall victim to the Germans? Until August 39, you can see, the number of murdered victims in hindsight is astonishingly small, just about 1,000. August 39, that is weeks before the attack on Poland in September 1939. Number of victims before the attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa in June 41, was around 200,000. The largest group of them were the disabled in Germany, the mentally disabled, euthanasia in Germany, 70,000. In the context of the decapitation policy against Poland, against the occupied Polish society, 52,000 Polish civilians were killed already at that point of time. And we have tens of thousands of Jews dying in the ghettos in Poland at this point already. If you compare Nazi Germany in summer 41 to other regimes, to Stalinist regimes or to the Japanese, or even to the Italians, or the Spanish, they were even worse. They were even worse. Japanese and the Stalinists especially by far. Now, until spring 1942, within 6 to 9 months, the number of victims of German policy jumps to 3 million. That is 2 million prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, about 900,000 Jewish victims, and a couple of 10,000 of other victims as well. So the development is around 1,000 to 200,000 to 3 million, and then until the end of the war, we have to add another 9 million, or more than 9 million. So that is basically the development of the sheer number of victims, the German policy. Very simple, but we forget this development very often. Over 98% of the German-induced murder took place after the German surprise attack on the Soviet Union in June 41, and most of it, I said that, outside the territory of the Reich. Only 3% of the victims of the Shoah were German Jews, 165,000, only 3%. Which constituted at that point of time only 0.7% of the German society. In 1933 was a tiny minority. Now, where did the Shoah take place? Of the 5.6 to 5.8 murdered million Jews, about 80% lived in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. You see, in Poland, Soviet Union, Romania, and Hungary. Meaning the Shoah, to 80%, actually took place in Eastern Europe. Less in Central Europe, less in Western Europe, or North or Southern Europe. Of those 5.8 million Jewish victims, we have about a little over 2 million dying through executions, through mass shootings. Over 2 million. 2.5 million have been killed in annihilation camps and concentration camps, mainly in annihilation camps. Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz, and Majdanek. About 1 million died in other circumstances, like diseases, cold, hunger, in the forest, etc., etc. Yeah? So, looking at this, 80% of the victims of the Shoah, Eastern Europe, over 2 million of them shot where they lived, meaning we should look at the societies where it took place, where these mass crimes took place. So today I will use Lithuania as the main example for illustrating the problems and the questions we have to research and analyze. Two basic triangles have been helpful for me to structure my approach and my questioning. What was the relation between the mass crimes and the occupation policy? That's where they took place mostly. And the conduct of war. We have seen the periodization. With the war, the number escalates dramatically. With the war against Poland already, and then massively with the attack against the Soviet Union. And the questions, of course, why? What's happening here? What is happening here? So, how did these three fields influence each other? If we want to research a mass crime, we should ask, how is it linked to the war, and how is it linked to the German occupation policy? Very often, when you look into the existing historiography, those fields are separated from each other. You have somebody working on the war, somebody working on the crimes, and a third one working on occupation. And I think, no, that's wrong. It's a wrong approach. It doesn't lead to plausible answers of the phenomena we're looking at. So what I'm trying to do is to relate those different fields, the war, occupation, and mass crimes. Second triangle is a question of the relations between the different groups involved. In this case, mostly between the Germans, the Jews, and the Lithuanians. So what I'm trying to do is to reconstruct the various perspectives of these groups. To reconstruct the various perspectives, trying to understand the distinct inner logics of those people acting, which then dominated the behavior of the different groups. Both triangles were intertwined. Both triangles are linked to each other, entangled. One cannot really analyze in a sufficient way the relations between warfare, occupation policy, and mass crimes without including the relations between the Germans, the Lithuanians, and the Jews in this space. And one cannot really study the relation between Germans, Lithuanians, and Jews without the conduct of war, the occupation policy, and the crimes. So I've tried to combine both triangles and the related questions. The main point I want to make today, and I keep repeating that, is that the Germans were not almighty. They depended on the willingness to cooperate by the non-Germans, and that to a much larger extent than most of us would think. Let me shortly explain that. So, this is a map we also used in class. It shows the German Empire in December 1941. December, half a year after the Germans had attacked the Soviet Union. And the very powerful Wehrmacht was placed in we can see how it was spread all over Europe. You can see it was mostly on the Eastern Front. There we have Moscow, there. And here's where the troops are. And the rest of Europe, there are scarcely troops. There are some here because of the British danger, so to speak. Yeah, here because of the Navy danger. But here in the hinterland, in the occupied Soviet territory, in Poland, we hardly have soldiers because they were needed at the front. Yeah, so the claim is, the hypothesis, that the German Empire was completely overstretched and depended on non-German paramilitary forces to control these territories in the hinterland. With the entrance into the war of the United States in December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and after Hitler declared war on the United States, 11th of December, from Nazi perspective, the whole of continental Europe was considered the hinterland. Yeah? This is German courtyard, all of continental Europe, because of the World War. Lithuania, let's look at Lithuania. We have the police forces, which were actually implementing much of the mass crimes. German Lithuanian forces. What do we find? In the political and criminal police, meaning the Gestapo, the political police, and the ones chasing major crimes against the normal civil law, we have between 60 to 100 Germans. Lithuanians, we have in the same space about 800 to 900, a bit more. German ordinary police, outside political and criminal police, we have about 500 in the whole of Lithuania. Yeah? In September 1942, this number was taken, and we have close to 12,000 Lithuanian policemen. Yeah? Among them, 1,700 at this point of time in the Lithuanian ordinary police, meaning stationed in the cities and villages, and 8,000 at that point of time, about 20 mobile police battalions. They were not all stationed inside Lithuania. At this point of time, you have 9 inside and 11 outside Lithuanian territory. So this situation is repeated in the agricultural sector. Now, agriculture and to rob, to make a terrorist policy in the frame of the agricultural policy, the German, was of huge and very often underestimated importance. The basic aim was to rob the harvest of summer and autumn 1941. The calculation was, otherwise we won't be able to continue with our warfare in this war, which is getting bigger and bigger. So we Germans have to starve 30 million Slavs. This was decided upon in May 1941. Yeah? This was not implemented because the war didn't go as the Germans wanted. And at the end in the second half of July 1941, this policy was reframed. We're not going to do a hunger policy against 30 million Slavs. No, we're going to starve the people we can control, that is the Soviet prisoners of war, which was not planned before the war. And we're going to kill as many civilians, and mostly Jews, if we German occupiers do not need them. Yeah? Meaning, the point here which we need to understand now is the Germans were highly interested in the agricultural products of the occupied territories. So how would you get them? You find in Lithuania about not more than 200 Germans working in this. But you have to get access to almost 450,000 farms. In little Lithuania, about over 400 farms, 400,000 farms. Again, you would rely on Lithuanian willingness to cooperate, to exploit the Lithuanian agricultural provinces. 15,000 Lithuanians cooperating with the Germans, taken from the former Lithuanian Ministry for Agriculture. Yeah? So you would need, this is the relation. Yeah? So, this leads to illustrate, so this helps me to illustrate the central dilemma of the Germans in occupied foreign states. And this wasn't the case only in Lithuania. I would say it was the case almost in every country they occupied. How do you combine extreme exploitation, which the overstretched empire needed to conduct the war, on the one side, and how do you keep the suppressed people, the occupied people, stable, quiet? How would you do that? They will not resist. How can 500 ordinary policemen control a populace of 2.5 million? If you use terror and force, you get a problem, because you provoke resistance. Yeah? And the aim must be, under these conditions of extreme exploitation, to guarantee the non-German willingness to cooperate. What does this mean in practice? When the Shoah, the Holocaust, was in full swing in Lithuania in autumn 1941 already. It happened in the north, mostly at the beginning of Lithuania, and the provinces of Šiauliai and Panevėžys. You have within 10 weeks 60,000 provincial Jews dead in August, September, October 1941. Very many, very fast. The point of time, you know, Babi Yar, which is sort of normally the symbol for executing Jews in the occupied Soviet Union, took place at the end of September. It's a number over 30,000. Kamenets-Podolsk, you have on the 23rd of August, 23,000. And just in the little north of Lithuania, in both provinces, you have 60,000. Yeah? Which Germans were there at that point of time? You have the Gebietskommissar, the German administrator for the whole district was Hans Gewicker. He was sitting in Cholet, and his staff was 10 to 12 people. 10 to 12 people, political functionaries. That's it. There was no German administration below the level of the Gebietskommissar. It was all Lithuanian county chiefs. Yeah? You have the mobile German police units going around, but they were also relying on Lithuanian cooperation, like basically in the ratio of 1 to 8, 1 to 10. It depended a bit. So that was the situation in the north when it started. Yeah? So how do you get, the German question was, of course, how do we get the Lithuanians to cooperate with us when we are doing this? And we Germans think this is necessary to do that. So what's happening here? Vilna, and during that period, yeah? October 1941. We all know about the selection in the city at that point of time. How many German functionaries do we have in the Stadtkommissariat? 8 to 10. That's it. 8 to 10. You do have, again, some police forces, but tiny numbers. 8 to 10. Yeah? Therefore, to understand a bit better what happened, we need to look at the societies under German occupation during the war where these mass crimes took place. And of course, we have to include in our general picture the societies which were not under German occupation. Romania, Slovakia, Croatia. Huge numbers of victims, but not under German occupation, but in close alliance with the Germans. So my claim is the following. The Shoah is not only part of German history, but an essential part of our common European history. Our common European history. We have over 20 non-German states or societies massively, even though to different degrees, involved in the Shoah if we count them according to the borders of the 1940s. Over 30 non-German states or societies if we count them according to the present borders in 2019. It would be, and for a long time it was, for many people, a comforting thought to assume that the Germans were almighty, omnipotent at the time. Whatever they wished to do, whatever our grandparents, great-grandparents wished to do, the Nazis, was implemented. But this is far from the historical truth. Of course, the Germans with the Nazi leadership were powerful, but in a whole range of aspects, they depended on the willingness to cooperate from the non-German peoples, their institutions, organizations, groups, and individuals. The important and the analytical point we have to look at is now that not only the Germans, but also the non-German people had a choice to make. And they have chosen. The question they had to answer was, in which respects are we ready to cooperate, and in which respects do we choose to ignore, to hinder a little bit, sabotage or resist the German demands? And people like the people in Lithuania made these choices in different fields of politics and at different points of time continuously. On paper, yes, they were powerless, but de facto, this was not the case. The Lithuanians would not be ready to act against most of their fellow Lithuanians in an ethnic sense. And the Germans knew this and took it into consideration. Now, what does this mean for the history of the Lithuanian behavior under German occupation? It means most importantly that Lithuanians did have to make a choice which the Jews did not have. So this notion of choice linked to power is very important for our understanding. Actually, it is crucial. A long time, this has not been debated in the historiography. This German historiography as an example. German historiography. For quite a long time, the dominant picture of the Third Reich was that people just followed orders from above. Dictatorship. Just following orders from above. Hitler and a few other evil men had forced through orders everybody else to participate in violent crimes. So this simple picture of order and obedience was then challenged in the 1970s by the claim that anonymous structures and processes were more important than orders from above. So this time the people acting were not just obeying, but were characterized as mindless cogs in the wheels. Just appendices to the structures and processes. Just opportunistic bureaucrats or technocrats, as many would argue, who did not really think about what they were doing in a complicated process. So both strands, the one intentionalism who thinks that everything comes from above, or the functionalists who say there are anonymous structures and processes going on here, both strands do not really integrate into their models the notions of choice and responsibility of the society, groups and individuals involved in the crimes. So since the 1990s, the basic assumption has become stronger and stronger that each and everybody has, at least in some way, a choice of what to do, how to act and react in difficult situations. So what we see is that people in the same or similar situations actually made different and various diverse choices. This means there's no determinism or automatism of how people will behave. And if we look at the different choices people made in the same situation in the contemporary context, we also avoid this knowing better in hindsight. Oh, they should have done this, they should have done that. I don't ask that question, what would I have done in that situation? No, what we can do as historians is look at the choices people made at the time, and there were various choices. Yeah? On the basis of which values did Lithuanians make their choice under German occupation? The ideological and cultural mainstream within the Lithuanian population was clearly nationalist. Nationalism had grown rapidly within the last 20 years during the time of independence, especially under Smetona. Became even stronger through the experience of Soviet rule 1940-1941. So the values of the whole society were massively influenced by the question, does this serve the Lithuanian nation state, or does it harm the Lithuanian nation state? Yeah. Now I'm trying to reconstruct, to look at this history from the Lithuanian point of view. Yeah? Does it harm, does it serve the Lithuanian nation state, or does it harm our common goal as Lithuanians of the Lithuanian nation state? So love of and service for the Lithuanian fatherland was the crucial norm, actually, the maßstab for many. Because for Lithuanians, the central trauma was not 1918, as for the Nazis, but 1940, when they lost their own nation state. So all future action and thinking was centered around the question how to rebuild a stronger Lithuanian nation state. Everything they perceived was centered around this one problem. This fed into what the sociologist Michael Mann has called nation-statism, the utopian expectation that the homogeneous nation state will solve all important problems. Now we find various strands within Lithuanian nationalism from 1926 onwards. The liberal and the left in the Lithuanian society was very, very weak. The dominating forces were the conservatives and the more extreme right. Right-wing radicals were slowly growing stronger. And these extreme right-wing people organized themselves in the Iron Wolf under Augustinas Voldemaras. Maybe I make a short remark, Voldemaras, Voldemort, who knows who Voldemort is? The name is coined after this Lithuanian fascist Voldemaras. Yeah? They had been pushing Smetona, the Voldemarists, without great success towards a more radical policy against non-Lithuanians. And within the conservatives, the non-so-radicals, the younger generation, and some right-wing radicals were actually the main, they were pushing towards a more radical nationalist policy. So in 1940-41, we find members of this younger conservative generation and some right-wing radicals actually as the main members of the so-called provisional government in June to August 1941. Now, very important now for the further involvement of Lithuanian police forces and Lithuanian political functionaries in the murderous anti-Jewish policy was the success of the radical right-wing at the end of July. The success of the radical right-wing at the end of July to overtake almost the complete leadership of all armed Lithuanian forces. These young soldiers and policemen were openly fascist and anti-Semitic, of course, in the name of a fascist version of the future Lithuanian nation state. And from this group came the main perpetrators who, all the time under German command, would isolate and murder the Lithuanian Jews in the cities and in the countryside. I repeat, to make it very clear, that we Germans were the main initiators of this. But the cooperation went smoothly with those Lithuanian fascists who got themselves, with the help of the Gestapo actually, in the position to dominate the paramilitary forces and the political functionaries in Lithuania. Now, one of the crucial questions is now, how did the rest of the Lithuanian society react? And why did they accept this unprecedented mass killing? Because we do not have one public statement, collective statement against the horror. The usual answer to this question is, well, it was a totalitarian state, totalitarian system. This was too dangerous. This top-down approach ignores what happened in many other political spheres at the time, outside the persecution and murder of the Jews. We find many public protests from the Lithuanians against German policy in the economic sector, in the educational sector, in the settlement sector, in the sector of anti-partisan warfare, but not in the anti-Jewish sector. Even though the German threat against any deviant behavior was the same in all fields, Lithuanian choices were varied depending on what the issue was. Just one example to illustrate this. When in the summer of 1943, the discussion began whether to kill the about 400 mentally disabled ethnic Lithuanians, which were in hospitals in Vilna and in Kalvaria, immediately public protests were organized by Lithuanian doctors and the church. Immediately. This was not acceptable, and the Germans decided not to implement it. No protests were heard when the Jewish disabled patients were murdered in fall 1941. Let me turn to the second part of today's talk. I have to be a little bit quicker, I'm seeing. So, are we dealing with one collective memory here? According to Morris Halbwachs, yes, we are. I would say no. This assumption is problematic as an historical phenomenon and as an analytical tool. Which collective is this supposed to be? Collective memory. Which collective is this supposed to be? And very often we find state attempts to unify remembrance. In a moment, we see it all over Eastern Europe, to unify remembrance. But that is part of the road to unfreedom. Memory is not something static, but dynamic. Today we know from neuroscience that memory is constructed in the moment we speak, constantly constructed in permanent processes. So we should expect constant change, constant debates and constant fights. All memory is formed in an expression of communication, of conflicts and differences, and the interpretation of historical events. And all our memories are embedded in our present contexts, our social, cultural, and political frameworks in which we live. Meaning plurality is a good sign. Too often, me too, we have the desire and the wish to create only one memory, one which is allegedly true and adequate. And we forget that we are always dealing with pluralistic memories which cannot be unified into one single form and shape. This is impossible unless we use force. In other words, all our work on memory is necessarily, by definition, a work in the field of conflicts, and that is fine. Second point I would like to underline, the past, full of mass crimes, is difficult for all societies in Europe, not only for Eastern Europe. Wait, wrong direction, sorry. Difficult for all of us. Very often we do find a kind of colonial perspective. When we Germans, or we Americans, or we Western Jews, look at the Eastern European people. You find it in the historiography very often that people, how could the civilized Germans murder people? Do we pose the same question when Lithuanians or Ukrainians come into the field? No, we don't. Yeah? Eastern Europeans are somehow half wild. Yeah? Somehow barbarians. Germans, British, French, Americans, Jews, we're civilized. And they, yeah? So there is some colonial attitude here, which we can't change easily. And we are ourselves part of this, but we need to be aware. Yeah? So, in our context, are Eastern Europeans more inclined to murder than Germans? No, of course not. No, they aren't. And I'm sure there are many Eastern Europeans here, right? Are you more inclined to murder? I hope not. So there's no place for colonial view here, for arrogance. Yeah? And then, after 45, each state was trying to victimize itself. Each state. The first ones were the Germans. Yeah? Who was the first victim of Hitler? It was us, of course. We Germans were the first victim. And then the Austrians came. No, we were the first victims. And then all the rest followed. Yeah? We are all victims of the Nazis. Yeah? So this was, and then it took a long time to come to today. So I'm not joining, actually, the common praise of the German Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I'm not joining that. There were so many things went wrong, yeah, in thinking, injustice, and that. So, yeah, I'm not joining the praise on that. Second remark, ethnic history. Besides the colonial attitude, there's another perspective very influential, which is a fatal trap. A fatal trap. The notion that our history is actually a history of Volkstumskämpfe, of ethnic struggles between peoples. What I did, the Germans against the Lithuanians against the Jews, is already wrong. Because these groups were not ethnic groups according to, like, with strict borders. Yeah? It's a construct. We take it from the 19th century, impose it on the complicated history, and think, this is a good way to sort what's happening. This is the Nazi view. The subject of history are whole peoples, and they must fight each other in a racist struggle of survival. Yeah? Instead, we need social and political analysis. So one of the simple myths that history is history of Volkstumskämpfe. Our cultures of remembrance are, yes, always linked to a certain group. That's us and that's not us. We are looking for stabilizing traditions and the effect of being able to act to coin identities and to create political, historical legitimacy. We all do that. We all do that. How do we want our state, our society, what do we want, what should it look like? What should it look like? Yeah? So the crucial question in this context is now, and I'm gonna, wait, wrong direction again, which nationalism? So this is gonna be my last argument for today. I think we have to differentiate between those two nationalisms, between ethnic nationalism and between civic nationalism, between civic patriotism. Yeah? Ethnic nationalism is the one based on the jus sanguinis, Latin, the law of the blood. Yeah? To which group I belong is determined by my parents and my grandparents. Yeah? Ethnic unity, biologistical, integral, no assimilation possible. Yeah? Our blood decides who we are. Is that so? And many people do believe that. The other form is civic nationalism or patriotism. They use solely. So, to which group you belong is determined by where you are born. Yeah? In which state? No? But it doesn't matter who your parents are. It depends on where you are and how you behave. And so the civic nationalism patriotism is much more inclined to allow civic, liberal, pluralistic societies. Assimilation is possible, even demanded. It's inclusive, not exclusive. And the citizenship is decisive that you have, meaning your rights and duties, not who your parents are. So this is the French version, historically, against the German version. The German is the bad one, the really bad one. The French version is not gentle, but it's more possible to live with it, I would say. Yeah? It really is. So, is it crucial because all memory is about us and them. In the Lithuanian case, we experienced that 2 years ago when Ruta Vanagaite and Efraim Zurov were publishing a book, Musiškai. Musiškai means we, ourselves. And they were talking about Lithuanian policemen because a relative of Ruta Vanagaite was actively involved into killing Lithuanian Jews. Yeah. On the cover, they had a picture of these two. Isakas Anolikas. He was Lithuanian Jew, born in Šiauliai, 1903. Murdered at the Kaunas 9th Fall in 1943. He was a Lithuanian cycling champion, the one on the left. Represented Lithuania at the 24 Olympics in Paris and 28 Olympics in Amsterdam. And he was shot by Balázs Novéša on the right. 10 years younger, born in 1913, lieutenant of the, and commander of the special unit Ypatingas Būrys. Yeah. You don't really know about the post-war fate of Novéša. There are reports that he emigrated to the States. We are not sure. Some people say he was killed during the bombing of Dresden in 1945. We don't really know. Important is that these two people were on the cover of the book, and the argument from Ruta Vanagaite and Efraim Zurov was, we killed ourselves. Not we killed, they killed us or we killed them, but we killed ourselves. It's a story of Musiškai. A story of civic patriotism, a story of civic nationalism here under occupation as an approach. In the most countries, we have the discussion between those two camps actually, between the ethnic nationalists and the civic patriotism. So both do love their patria, their fatherland, their nation. Same with us Germans. Yeah? We all love our country, but how we do that is, of course, decisive here. Yeah? These discussions between various camps has long traditions. In the Lithuanian case I mentioned, we have Smetona on the one side, who was inclusive. There's not one anti-Semitic law as long as Smetona was dictator in Lithuania until 1940, not one. And he was constantly fought by Voldemaras, who wanted ethnic policy, just for ethnic Lithuanians, against the Jews, against the Poles, against the Russians, against the Germans. We have the same in Poland, the debate between Pilsudski and Dmowski. Same thing. I have to stop. Last remark. Eastern Europe, we must not forget Soviet history. We must not forget Soviet history. We really have to integrate this into the picture. This is very difficult, long way to go. We all have to learn about this in the East and in the West. How to integrate Soviet history into the narrative. This means history itself. How to do that. There are a few books which have done that in a good way, I believe. But we have to continue. Tim Snyder is one of them. And concerning memory, of course. Because Soviet history was also, when you look at it closely, much more varied than we know. Than we usually expect. Oh, Soviets didn't do anything. Everything vanished in the Soviet people and the creation of this new Soviet human being. No. Yeah? Now a book comes out from Arkady Seltzer about memory of Jewish Red Army soldiers, and he found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of phenomena which illustrate, yes, their Jewishness was mentioned in the Soviet society, right? So this is very exciting. Let me conclude. Central to take on the responsibility for our own history, not as we wished history had been, but as it actually was, to the best of our knowledge. Very often our memory fails us, needs corrections by the history we learn. When we understand that, we will not do the stupid game of competitive victimhood. Because that is basically a topic for ethnic nationalists. As if the suffering of one group diminishes the suffering of another group, based on the assumption we are part of a zero-sum game. We find this discourse already in underground papers in 1943, fully formulated in 1946, 1947. This is all about externalizing guilt, not accepting responsibility for your own history. I believe that is valid for Lithuania, but also for most other societies in this respect. Let's just think of the conflicts in Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, for example, but also, for example, of the Brexit, England, Great Britain. The same structures here going on. So the self-critical and dynamic perspective on our history provides a far better basis and a more solid ground to stand on and to live together than the acceptance of a stagnant, simple myth where we admire shining heroes, mourn their and the victim's sacrifice, and condemn villains. Real history is far more complex and complicated than that, because we are dealing with real human beings, not with simplified myths. And this is the only history we have. It is never just black or white, so scrutinizing myths does not lead to bloodshed, as some people say. It is a wrong instrumentalization of myth which leads to the demonization of others and eventually to bloodshed. Central question is therefore how to respond to one's own crimes in our common European history, and this is what I wanted to think about with you today. Thanks a lot for listening.
Two quick questions.
Yes. We still do have 10 more minutes, right?
Okay, I'm very happy you brought up this issue with the civic nationalism, the German one, the negative one versus the French one.
Yeah.
Because only a month ago, it was a big error that the current president Macron did against Donald Trump at the end of the celebration of the 100 years of the end of the First World War. When they were in Paris, they were in the national anthem of French, aux armes citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons, consanguins purs, abreuve nos sions. This is nationalistic, but it's a positive one. And yet, Macron was criticizing Trump for no reason.
Exactly.
Okay, so it was a wrong way, it was contradicting himself based on what you just said, that it's a French nationalism is a positive one. Second issue, which I noticed, I'm sorry to inform you, a big error in one of your maps. The first,
go ahead.
Yeah, the first map of Europe with a number of Jews. You showed that Hungary had 403,000. No way, it was double that amount, 800 and something thousand. I know for sure. Romania had 760,000, out of which 400 were killed and 360 were alive after the Second World War. Hungary lost all of them because Adolf Hitler was delegated to take care of them. Yeah. They were all sent to Birkenau. 400,000 in 4 months.
Yeah. Do you remember which date the map was about?
I'm sorry?
Which year the map was about?
Well,
1939.
Well,
That was before the treaty, before the changing of the borders between Romania and Hungary in 1939, 1940, 1941. So for this point of time, the number is correct. It then changed
I know, but
till 1944.
The parts of Romania who were taken by Hungary, they were,
Yes,
they were killed
yes.
by Hungarians, the fascists, not by the Romanians.
Yes, I know. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Further comments,
Test.
please.
Does this work?
It was a rather startling article.
I can't hear you.
Hello?
There was a rather startling article in the newspaper earlier.
We can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
No.
If you could just speak into the mic.
Not sure which channel it's supposed to
There was a rather startling article in the newspaper earlier this week. 1.4 million Jews murdered in 30 days, approximately 14,000 a day in 1942. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, of course. There's a new book, obviously, out, which I haven't seen, by a professor of biology using mathematic methods, and he read Yitzhak Arad, a book from Yitzhak Arad on the Aktion Reinhardt, meaning the destruction of the Polish Jews decided upon in spring 1942, when the Germans decided till the end of the year, we Germans must destroy 1.2 million of the Polish Jews, leave 300,000 alive, for various reasons. Because Jews are enemies, Jews use up too many resources, and we want to put the Poles in a bit better position. It's difficult with them because the war is not going as good as we wanted it to be. And this is the background for the annihilation camps of Sobibor, of Treblinka, of Belzec, continuation of Chelmno, and then leading to Auschwitz and Majdanek being used also as annihilation camps, not only as concentration camps, meaning for forced labor under barbarous traditions. So, meaning, so we have this decision on the Polish Jews. At the same time, a similar decision was taken on the Ukrainian Jews, on the Jews in Ukraine, to kill another 300,000 to 400,000 of them. So if people would read, they would find it in the literature. Yeah? I would say the number is even higher than 1.4. Yeah, it's about 1.6 to 7. Not in 30 days, but in about 10 to 12 weeks. In the second half of 1942, a year later than the Lithuanian Jews. So in order to explain this, we need to look at the problems of the Germans in the Polish society under occupation, and the problems of the Germans in Ukrainian society under occupation. And we do have the documents for this. We do have the documents for this. We just discussed that in class a couple of days ago. That's why I'm proposing this broad approach. We have to think not only of anti-Semitism and bad Germans. No, we have to do political and social analysis. The basic impulse here was that the center in Berlin said, we need more resources from Eastern Europe, especially from Poland and from Ukraine. The general government had provided 50,000 tons of grain. 50,000 tons of grain for Germany and the rest of Europe in 1941. Now the center said, 50,000 not anymore, 600,000 for the general government, 600,000. So, and no debate, because the people in Hans Frank and his staff in Krakow, they didn't believe what they were getting. This is impossible. I said, no, this stands. Yeah? And then the decision was taken, okay, we have to very quickly, through the fall of 1942, we have to annihilate most of Polish Jewry and just leave those alive, not close to 300,000, which are still useful for the conduct of war, for the German conduct of war. Ukraine, Erich Koch, who was the Reichskommissar in Ukraine, he got the order 100% delivery to Germany of everything that was left over by the Wehrmacht. 100% delivery. Completely impossible. So what does he do? They were decent anti-Semites. Yeah? So they would direct this, of course, against the Jews, because they're dangerous anyway. Yeah? In the eastern parts, in eastern White Russia and eastern Ukraine, the Jews were already killed, because that was closer to the front. The Wehrmacht had already taken everything that was there. In the west, Galicia, we have 80%, I was talked about this with Ben Cohen from the Allgemeine, in this article. Lithuania, 80% of the Jews were dead, end of 41. Galicia, 80% still alive. This changed then in 1942. In the context I've sort of tried to hint at. Yeah? So, meaning there is nothing new here. I don't know the arguments behind this. I just read that he kind of dealt with mathematically with the number of deportation trains. And for number of deportation trains, you don't read Yitzhak Arad. Yeah? He was great 25 years ago. Yeah? But today we have full lists basically of all the deportation trains going all over Europe all the time. If you count them, maybe as something new, I wouldn't expect that, actually. I would not expect that, because we know a lot about this. All right?
Yeah, thank you. I fear perhaps you're downplaying the role of... Oh, sorry. Okay, is this better? Yeah. I fear you may be downplaying the role of, well, the occupation. I'll give you an example.
The role of occupation?
Yeah. Example, Netherlands. Okay, this is... I'm picking a country which had one of the highest proportion of murdered Jews in Western Europe. The society was quite different than in Lithuania, and yet there was almost complete success on the part of the Germans. So I don't want to be an apologist for the Germans on this one, and I fear that perhaps by overemphasizing the role of Lithuanian society, and so on and so forth, there's something else going on here too, and that is the sense of helplessness of being under occupation. I don't think the entire Dutch population had a different history. Number one, there was no occupation by the Soviets. It was a Western society. It was historically a liberal society and all. And I won't go on with that. The other point I wanted to make was you look at another country, such as Bulgaria, which was, now, it was allied with Germany, and yet the same society, it was almost 100% success rate other than in the occupied parts of Macedonia and Yugoslavia, Thrace and so on. So my only fear is that by I sense that you're downplaying the role of the decision makers, and that was the occupiers, and ultimately Lithuania would not have had the Holocaust but for the Germans. I can't match up your theory with what happened, for example, in Netherlands. I guess that's where we're going. So I don't know what your thoughts would be on that.
Okay. I'm not sure if I've understood you right, because usually the death rate of the Jews in the single European countries is linked to the quality of the people. Dutch is a kind of exception, because Dutch are supposed to be liberal and nice. And the death rate in Holland was quite high. Now, much higher than in Belgium, for example. Are the Belgians more nicer people than the Dutch? Well, we're not sure. Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Poles are bad people, so that's why we have over 90% death rate there. Yeah? Bulgaria is a specific case, because we have in old Bulgaria, so to speak, in Bulgaria proper, you have the state institutions, organizations, the church, the government, defending the local Jews. And the Germans would not touch it. But outside, there were two areas annexed from Macedonia. Thracia and what's the name of the other one? and there close to 12,000 Jews were gladly given to the Germans. 12,000 Jews, Bulgarian Jews, under Bulgarian rule, were gladly pushed over to the Germans. So this territory would be cleansed of the Jews and being taken over by Bulgaria. So my argument is actually, that's what I tried to do with those triangles. Yes, link all the crimes to the occupation, to the specific situation, the specific context, specific time, specific place, and the conduct of war. Because the conduct of war is very obvious also. Everything is happening between 42 and 45, it gets even more complicated. Hungary, it was already mentioned, at first gladly cooperates with the Germans when they invade the country in 1944, and then they switch positions. That's why we have half of the Hungarian Jews surviving. The same with Romania. Without any German initiative, Romania killed more than 200,000 Jews. Without any German involvement, the war was going bad. So in late 42, in early 43, Romania's elite changed its mind, and Romanian Jews were saved. Meaning, I want to understand the different death rates in the single countries, not by looking at the character of the people involved, but through political, social analysis, looking at the war, looking at the occupation policy at a specific point of time. Yeah? So actually we are on the same side.
I don't think we are.
All right, I think we have to go on. There are many other questions.
So, there is one word that you mentioned that is a little bit of concern to me.
Okay.
It is the nationalism.
Yes.
The ethnic nationalism
Yes.
that happened. I'm seeing now happen now with the results all over Europe of
Yes.
elections.
Yes.
Are we going to repeat the history? Are we going there again?
I don't think we are better people than the people in the 30s and 40s. I don't think we are better people. They weren't worse than us. And it all depends on the choices we make, on the strength of our institutions, of the strength of our thinking and analysis. Yeah? How much are we ready to give for open societies, for democratic societies, for liberal societies? Yeah? I mean, it's weird to say in this context of debating German mass crimes. In Germany, it's still, we still feel relatively comfortable. Why? Because the German government, the main institutions in Germany, when the last big crisis was looming, there was 2007, 2008, with the world economic crisis, with the financial disasters happening. What was the reaction of the politicians, led by Central Europeans, so to speak, and together with Obama, the decision was, we continue to cooperate, and we don't go into the same trap as we as Europeans did in the 1930s, that we go down the road of economic nationalism, of America first, of Germany first, of Britain first, of France first. We don't do that, because that's a downward spiral. And the belief that this would lead to something better, just to think of yourself, of an imagined self, of an imagined community, us, yeah, is sheer illusion. Is sheer illusion. Yeah? The only way forward is to cooperate. Yeah? So the answer would be, because I don't believe that there's some determinism in history. There are no laws. No biological laws in history, and no social laws, and no racist laws. It depends on the choices we make. It depends on the choices we make. It's easily said, I mean, all know, awfully hard to make, to implement. But that's actually the case, I would say. So the lesson from history is, try to understand the situation you're in. Yeah? And to let your memory, let your perception be corrected by facts, by learning about history and learning about the present politics. And don't think shouldn't think we know everything. Nobody of us does. And those people who do Stay away, they are dangerous.
Can I be heard? I'm heard? Okay. I have a comment and a question. Certainly what you say about the shared anti-Semitism of many countries in Europe cannot be denied. The role of occupation has to be considered nevertheless. But would you say that there is some evidence in the history of Germany, as well as in Russia actually, that was particularly anti-Semitic? For example, the very famous historian at the end of the 19th century who said the Jews are our misfortune, Trotsky, was still being taught in the 1930s in Germany. In other words, there's a history of hostility toward the Jews, and it seems to me that in German history, there is also a tension between various parts of Germany, and the problem of nationalism became particularly intense. And so if you're going to talk about history and the realities of memory, it strikes me that you can't leave out this whole history that is peculiar and particular to the German development.
How would we sketch the development of the anti-Semitism in Germany when we want to explain the behavior of the Nazis? The central, Treitschke was still, the historian she mentioned about the Jews are die Juden sind unser Unglück. There was the Jews are our misfortune. After the Gründerkrise, my boys just learned about that. They were saying, okay, the Jews are not good for Germany, for the building up of the German Reich. That was still a very traditional anti-Semitism, actually. And Treitschke had also this, he didn't like the Eastern Europeans, including the Jews. Decent German Jews, he was fine with. When you read the article today again, he was fine with the German Jews, the civilized ones. He wasn't fine with the barbarians from the East. But this is not relevant actually so much for the behavior of the Nazis, because what we need to understand, if we want to understand the Nazis, is their perception, and we also talked about that in class, their perception of 1918 and 19, of World War I. And this changed massively the perception of certain segments of the German society of the role of the Jews in German history. Because why did we Germans lose the war? Because of the collapse of the home front. Soldiers were still in Ukraine, still in Belgium, still in France. The home front collapsed. There were strikes, there was hunger. Yeah? And who was guilty here? It's the left and the Jews. And this, it's the stab in the back. The fifth column at home. That is why we lost the war. And that is why in World War II, the moment the whole Europe turned into the German backyard, all Jews have to go as potential partisans, as potential saboteurs. The war was difficult, and Jews are dangerous here, to have them at home. And this home was supposed to be the whole of Europe. The point is, I would emphasize much more than in usual literature the rupture of 1918 and 1919, not as it really was, but as the Nazis perceived it, and then came to power for various reasons, actually, only 10 to 12 years later, in the 1930s. That's a lot later, yeah? Throughout the 20s, they were a tiny group. Yeah? And then the stab in the back story came back up again. This is very important. This is much more important than the usual sort of differentiation between traditional anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism on the one side, and political and scientific on the other ones. I don't buy this distinction, actually. Yeah? Because in most anti-Semitisms you find that they are so entangled. Lithuania, they don't have a clue of modern anti-Semitism, basically. Jews are the devil. for the Lithuanian fascists. The devil, and that's a religious category. They wouldn't say evil, the evil, as in a secular version. They would say the devil. And when you go today into Lithuanian churches, you see the devil in the church, in the paintings, looks Jewish somehow. Yeah? So this distinction between modern and pre-modern anti-Semitism is very often not really persuading. Yeah? What is persuading is the role the Jews play in our history, in our national, and for the Nazis, in world history. We know from World War I that the Jews are evil for modernity. The whole disaster of liberalism, democracy, capitalism, meaning World War I, who is guilty? The Jews. And if we get the Jews out, we can build a better modernity. The Nazis were not an anti-modern movement, no. They wanted to build another modernity without all the flaws. Because the flaws would be gone with the exclusion and in a certain situation, even the murder of the Jews. So this is a different approach, no? And the sort of the conservative bourgeois segment of German society who would read Treitschke, they would say, oh, the Nazis, well, they do have a point, but they are too radical, actually. Yeah? And then they would say, in a situation of war, when the question is them or us, then we side with the Germans. Then we side with the Germans. No, with our own people, so to speak. Okay?
We'll take one more question.
I think your analyses have been fascinating, but I do think that you did not adequately answer the question about the Netherlands.
About memories.
Now, if I recall correctly, the Queen...
Netherlands. Okay.
Yes. The Queen of the Netherlands did leave, and I think passed the war in England. I don't know what the rest of the government that remained in the Netherlands was like, because you were saying that it depended upon the political structures in individual countries. So how would you explain in this country, which was traditionally tolerant and liberal, in which the monarchy was opposed to the Nazis and indeed fled, how would you then explain the high percentage of Dutch Jews who were killed?
I completely agree that I did not answer the question on Netherlands properly. I didn't. What I wanted to do when I taking up that question was to make propaganda for my approach of not looking at different peoples and their characters, but to use social and political analysis to research and analyze what was happening. One of the little reasons behind it is I don't know. I know from my colleagues that there's a constant debate, actually already going on for 70 years, why are the death rates of Jews so different between France, Dutch, and Belgium? Why are they so different? Yeah? And I don't think they have found the answer. I don't think they have, I didn't read one answer which was persuading. Everybody who writes on the Shoah in Europe is making an effort at this. Yeah? In today, when you read Snyder, when you read Gerlach, when you read whatever, you always have, well, this explains it, this explains it, this explains it. I'm not convinced. Yeah? I don't think we know yet. Well, maybe others are more intelligent than me and would accept answers. Yeah? What is important is to understand that it's an important question. It is an important question. And it shows us that if we only point at anti-Semitism, it's not enough. That 75% of the French population, of the French Jews, survived. 25% were deported, 75%, this means Vichy. This means a fascist government, sovereign, acting sovereign, introducing anti-Jewish laws on their own, and deporting non-French Jews willingly, but protecting somehow 75% of French Jews coming into the country before 1918. What is that? No? Same with the Belgium. The Belgium case is weird. Low death rate, something like 30–40%, but mostly non-Belgian Jews. Belgium doesn't really have a tradition of masses of Jews. So there were refugees, and still the Belgians the Belgian Jews, the Jews in Belgium survived easier than in other regions, which were neighboring. Some point to economy, some point to the police forces, some point to the cooperation of the non-Germans with the Germans, some point to the German government was different. I don't know. But what's important is here not to know all the answers, but to pose the right questions. Yeah, that's how I would react to this criticism, which is most welcome.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Dieckmann.